I'm going to read to you from a very old book. I bought it at a thrift store. It's very old. It's called The Book of Knowledge. And it was published in 1923. So some of the information may not be very accurate anymore. But it is definitely interesting. The first subject is, why do I dream? The brain has many parts, and some parts of it may be asleep, while another part is awake and active. That is what happens when we dream. Most of the brain, especially the highest part of it, is asleep in a dream, but parts of it are awake. These, unguided by the highest powers of the mind, work on the experiences we have had, especially recent happenings. Perhaps only the very deepest sleep is entirely free from dreams, and it seems certain that most of us have dreams of which we remember nothing when we awake. The more vague and shadowy and the more easily forgotten a dream is, the fewer are the parts of the brain that have been awake. But when we have long and complete dreams, very clear and very clearly remembered, then it is possible that more of the brain has been awake. The fewer dreams we have, the better, for that means that our sleep has been more complete. And if we are to have dreams, it's best to have the kind which are scarcely remembered. No dream has any meaning about the future. By far, the worst kind of dream is a nightmare, a dream which seems very real and is horrible. When nightmares occur, often they should be attended to. In some people they are due to heart disease, which prevents the supply of blood to the brain from being evenly maintained. But, as a rule, a nightmare has its origin in the stomach, and it's disagreeable because it is aroused by disagreeable sensations there. By far the most common of all these causes is indigestion, and everyone who is liable to nightmares should be very careful about what he eats before going to bed. On no account should such a person take a heavy meal less than 3 hours before going to bed. Besides the unpleasantness of nightmares, we should remember that they mean that the sleeper is not getting sleep of the best quality, and his waking hours will suffer accordingly. Sometimes we seem to do quite impossible things when we dream, and are never surprised at doing them. The reason is that in a dream, the very highest part of our brain, the part which has to do with our knowledge of ourselves, with judgment, and with the power of distinguishing between what is real and what is only fancied, is asleep, and so unable to do its work. When we are awake, we may often build castles in the air, or imagine ourselves doing wonderful things. But the highest part of the brain remains active so that all the time we know we are only imagining these things. The next chapter is, why does furniture make a noise at night? Perhaps we cannot be quite certain that furniture cracks so much more at night than in the daytime. For one thing, there are other noises going on in the daytime which we're more likely to be hearing. For another, it's known that when we lie awake at night, in the dark, our hearing is more acute than it usually is in the daytime. Still, when all this is allowed for, it's no doubt true that furniture does make strange noises at night, and that it's not difficult to understand if we remember that the air has been warmed up more or less during the day, and then cools down again during the night. The general rule, which is true of wood as it is of most other things, is that things expand as they are heated, and they shrink as they are cold. Thus, furniture is liable to shrink more or less at night as it cools. And we can understand how different parts may suddenly slip a little and so start the waves in the air, which make us say that the furniture is cracking. The question of moisture may play a part too, because as air cools, it is apt to deposit the moisture which it could hold in itself when it was hotter, and that moisture is apt to affect the state of whatever object it is deposited upon. The next subject: why have we two eyes? Sometimes we may have noticed that people, in pouring milk or putting a lump of sugar in a teacup, have made a mistake and put the milk and sugar in the saucer. That is what is very likely to happen to anyone who only uses one eye. The two eyes do not look at anything from exactly the same place, but from rather different points of view, as we say. The brain takes these 2 points of view and sees from both of them together, so that it's very much helped in judging distances by the difference between the two images of a thing seen by the two eyes. It is because we have two eyes that we see things in their relation in front of or behind each other. An ordinary photograph looks flat because, so to say, the camera saw it with only one eye. But if we take two photos of a thing from 2 points of view corresponding to the distance between the two eyes, and then put the two photos side by side at the right distance, and look at them with both eyes, do this simple little instrument called a stereoscope or solid seer, then we see the view as if it were solid, or see it in relief as possible, as people say. We see it as we should have seen the thing itself if we had looked at it with our own two eyes. Next subject: how is it that fishes are not salt when caught? The part of the fish that we judge by is its muscles, which form its flesh and which we eat. Though the fish lives in salt water, it takes into its blood only what it requires for the purpose of its life. This is an important thing which we must remember. If we look at it in this way, we shall understand how it is that the saltness of a fish's muscles is not very different from that of a chicken's muscles. When we study the whole animal world, we find that the proportions of salt required in the water or in the blood that we find in the bodies of many different creatures are very much the same. The cells that make up muscles are very much the same in their way of living and their needs, whether we find them in a bird, a fish, an ox, or a human. Thus we should not expect to find the flesh of the fish salter than that of another creature, nor to find that it makes any particular difference whether the fish is a saltwater fish or a freshwater fish. We must remember that the fish, like ourselves, has the power of choosing from the things which it swallows, just those things which it needs for its life, and of taking them and them only into its blood. Why is a snowflake lighter than a raindrop? A snowflake is made of ice crystals, that is to say, solid water. Now it is a most important and peculiar fact about water that ice is lighter than liquid water, even though it's colder and harder. The general rule, of course, is that things get heavier as they get colder, and lighter as they get hotter, as heat expands them and cold contracts them. But at just near its freezing point, water does not obey this rule. It expands as it gets colder, and it freezes. That is why it sometimes bursts pipes in winter if they're not protected from the frost. So, a snowflake is made of water in a lighter state than the water in a raindrop, and yet Another reason why the snowflake is lighter is that there is a great deal of air in among the ice crystals. This makes the whole thing lighter, just as the air in the bones of a bird makes them lighter and therefore assists their flight. Why is it hotter at the equator than in Maine? We know that the equator is the name given to the great line that we imagine to run around the middle. Of course, there is no real line except on the maps and globes. The belts or zones of the earth on both sides of the equator are called the tropic zones and are the hottest parts of the earth's surface. The reason is that no matter whether it's summer or winter, farther north or farther south, in the temperature zones, in one of which Maine is, the tropic zones are always very directly exposed to the sun's rays, which strike down more vertically, where the sun rises very high up into the top of the sky in the tropical regions, and so it is always very hot there. But it is too hot for human life at its best, and the greatest achievements of man with hand or brain have been made on one side or other of the tropical region. Does a rock breathe? This is the next section. At first sight, this seems to be rather an absurd question because we always associate breathing with living creatures, and rocks are certainly not alive in the ordinary sense of the word. It really depends on what we mean by the word breathe. Rocks do not have lungs. They do not take in oxygen, then give out carbon dioxide as we do. But if by breathe we simply mean take in oxygen, then the answer is yes. Long ages ago, the rocks took in huge amounts of oxygen when they were being formed. It's reckoned that there is as much oxygen contained in a container of rocks a few feet deep as in the air above them. This process of the intake of oxygen from the air by rocks still goes on in some degree, and it helps in part to explain why many kinds of rocks crumble and break down and wear away from year to year, especially when we take the wearing action of rain or wind into account as well. Why did the hills look blue at a distance? The blueness of the sky is so due partly to reflection of the blue rays of sunlight from dust particles in the air, and partly, as Lord Rayleigh showed, to the blue color of the nitrogen gas in the air. Now, if we look through a layer of anything that is colored at something beyond it, the layer will contribute its own color to the color we see. The blueness of the air, however, is a very faint blue, and we do not usually notice the blueness it contributes to anything near. But when we look at distant hills, we are looking through such a thick layer of air that it gives them a blue tinge. But the actual color which we see depends upon many other things, as for instance, the color of the hills themselves and the time of day, which decides the angle at which the sunlight falls upon the hills, and also affects the color of the sunlight. That is enough to explain why the color of hills changes from moment to moment. And the last subject, what makes the sea roar? Roaring is a kind of sound, and though sound is something that can travel in all kinds of matter, it's usually, as we know it, a wave in the air, because as a rule our ears are not pressed up against any solid thing, nor are they underwater, and so all sounds that reach them must reach them through the air. This is true when we hear the sea roar, though a swimmer, when he goes head first through a wave, may hear a roaring coming through the water when he is below the surface. Everywhere the surface of the water is in contact with the air, and if the water moves violently, it may start in the air those waves which our ears can hear and which we call sound. These waves are of the kind that are not very numerous in each second, and so they make sounds of low pitch which we call roaring. Sometimes when a wave breaks, a great volume of water may fall upon the rest of the water, and so make a sound which is more like an explosion than a roar. Tennyson wrote once about what he called the scream of the Madan beach, and it is very interesting to notice that We do hear on the beach sounds that are much more like a scream than like a roar, though the sea itself never screams. It is the beach and not the water itself that makes the scream, and the kind of scream will depend on the kind of beach. Soft sand will not scream, but where there are pebbles of certain kinds, as the waves move up and down, they rub the pebbles against each other, and that produces airwaves of a quicker rate which may be likened to a scream.